Imagine a hidden gospel buried beneath the sands of Egypt. Words written by Christians whose faith was outlawed, their truth erased. For centuries the world knew only one version of Christianity. But then, in 1945, a farmer broke open a clay jar near Nag Hammadi, and history cracked open with it. These texts spoke of light trapped in flesh, of a God beyond the creator of the world, of salvation through knowledge, not obedience. Who were these people? What did they believe? And why did the church silence them? The desert wind carries dust across forgotten ruins. Somewhere between the silence of history and the echo of faith, a question begins to stir. What did the first Christians really believe? In the first century after Christ's death, there was no single Christianity, no neat hierarchy, no universal creed. What existed instead was a scattering of communities, each interpreting the words of Jesus through their own language, culture, and struggle. In Jerusalem, followers still tied to Jewish law debated how much of their heritage to keep. In Antioch, preachers blended Hebrew prophecy with Greek philosophy. In Rome, small gatherings whispered prayers beneath the threat of persecution. They all called themselves Christian, yet the shape of that word changed from house to house. The world was restless. Empires shifted, gods multiplied, and truth itself seemed uncertain. The Roman roads carried not only soldiers and traders, but also ideas that collided, merged, and reinvented one another. Pagan thinkers spoke of a divine realm of perfection beyond the reach of mortals. Jewish mystics dreamed of visions and angels revealing secret wisdom. Egyptian priests recited hymns about hidden gods and the cycle of death and rebirth. Out of this storm of belief, early Christians tried to make sense of the mystery that had entered the world through Jesus. But there was no Bible yet. The text that would one day be bound together as the New Testament were still letters circulating between communities, copied by hand, debated, and occasionally doubted. The Gospel of Mark was the earliest, raw and urgent. Matthew and Luke reshaped it with new layers of meaning. John came later, philosophical, otherworldly, almost mystical. Some groups read only Paul's letters, others trusted secret sayings attributed to Jesus, words passed from disciple to disciple like hidden pearls. Persecution drove many underground. To survive, they met in small circles, sometimes at night, often in code. Fish symbols marked their doors. Simple phrases like "peace be with you" became passwords. In these gatherings, authority was fluid. A woman could lead prayer in one city while being ammonitzed in another. A bishop in one region could be a heretic in the next. Faith was personal, alive, and dangerously free. And in that freedom, something remarkable began to grow. A vision of Christianity not as obedience to a church, but as a journey toward inner revelation. These believers felt that salvation was not about belonging to a visible community or accepting doctrines decreed by leaders. Instead, it was about knowing, not in the intellectual sense, but as a deep awakening to the divine spark within. They called this Gnosis, a word that simply meant knowledge, but to them it was the difference between blindness and sight, ignorance and awakening. Theirs was a time without consensus, and that uncertainty bred creativity. Theologians in Alexandria merged Christian ideas with Plato's vision of eternal forms. In Syria, mystics described visions where Christ appeared as pure light. In Asia Minor, some began to wonder if the God of the Old Testament, jealous, wrathful, bound to matter, was truly the Father Jesus spoke of. These were not questions born of rebellion, but of yearning. The human soul, they believed, had forgotten its origin. To rediscover it required revelation, a remembering of who we truly were before the world distracted us. Roman rule only intensified this longing. Under emperors who demanded worship, many believers saw the physical world as corrupt, a cage built to distract from the higher reality. When soldiers tore down temples and burned villages, when hunger spread and tyrants ruled, the idea that this world was broken felt undeniable. If the material was evil, then perhaps salvation meant escaping it. And if creation itself was flawed, then perhaps the Creator was not the ultimate God, but a lesser being who misunderstood the light. These thoughts frightened the guardians of order. The emerging church feared chaos. Too many interpretations, too many truths. They wanted unity, structure, a single creed to hold together the fragile identity of a persecuted people. But the seekers who would later be called Gnostics resisted that narrowing. For them, the mystery of God could not be captured in rules or rituals. It was infinite, layered and hidden behind appearances. Imagine being one of them, living in a city where temples to Roman gods still stood, yet you gathered in secret rooms to speak of an invisible Father beyond all names. You listened to your teacher explain that the world you touched was a shadow, that inside you was a forgotten fragment of divine light. You closed your eyes, searching for that spark, believing that Christ had come not to die for your sins, but to remind you of your true home. This was the first stage of a revolution in thought, a movement born from the cracks in certainty. Before heresy had a name, before orthodoxy had power, the faith of the first centuries was fluid, breathing, searching. The soil from which Gnosticism would grow was already fertile with questions. Who is God? What is the soul? Why is there suffering in a world created by a supposed good being? As centuries passed, these questions would divide believers, ignite councils, and shape the very boundaries of what would later be called Christianity. But here, in the candlelit gatherings of seekers, none of that had yet hardened. There were only questions and a hunger for truth. A hunger that would soon give birth to a daring new vision of reality, one that claimed the divine was not somewhere above the heavens, but buried deep within every human being waiting to be remembered. And as that vision spread, it would challenge the foundations of the church itself. The age of Gnosis was about to begin. The candlelight flickers on clay walls. A teacher unrolls a papyrus and begins to speak, not with authority, but with wonder. The followers gathered around are silent, listening as if to a secret being whispered through time. The kingdom, he says, is within you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known. The words come not from the canonical Gospels, which few of them have ever seen, but from another text, a collection of sayings they call the Gospel of Thomas. The teacher explains that to know oneself is to remember where the soul came from. The body is dust, but within it burns a spark of divine origin. To awaken that spark is to escape the blindness of the world. For these early seekers, gnosis, knowledge, was not something taught by priests or measured in scriptures. It was direct revelation, a memory of light that could not be inherited, only experienced. This idea did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from centuries of philosophical soil. In Greece, Plato had spoken of the soul's fall from the world of forms into the shadow of the matter. In Egypt, priests told of the god Osiris torn apart and reassembled, his death and rebirth mirroring the journey of every soul. In Jewish mysticism, prophets saw visions of divine realms and secret names of God. The Gnostics gathered these fragments and built from them a new cosmology, one that promised freedom not through faith in authority, but through awakening from illusion. Their world was drenched in uncertainty. The Roman Empire was vast and merciless, cities full of wealth and misery side by side. To survive, most people turned to ritual, sacrifice, and obedience, anything that might bring favour from the gods or protection from fate. But the Gnostics believed the true God did not demand offerings or temples. The divine was unknowable, infinite, and beyond all creation. The world of stone and suffering was not his work. It was a shadow, a flawed imitation, crafted by a lesser being who mistook himself for God. That being, they said, was the demiurge, a proud, ignorant creator who shaped the material world but could not touch the realm of spirit. This was not blasphemy to them, but a profound explanation for the brokenness they saw everywhere. How could a perfect God make a world full of pain, corruption, and decay? The answer, they believed, was simple. He didn't. A lower power had taken the fragments of divine light and trapped them in matter. Humanity was that prison, but also the key. The more they reflected on this mystery, the more radical their vision became. If the visible world was imperfect, then true reality must lie beyond it. If the soul was divine, then salvation was not forgiveness of sin, but liberation from ignorance. And if Christ had come, it was not to die as a sacrifice to the demiurge's laws, but to awaken humanity to the higher truth, that each person carried within them the light of the hidden God. In the city of Alexandria, a crossroads of Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism, this vision flourished. Scholars debated in marble courtyards while sailors traded stories in taverns near the harbour. Libraries overflowed with scrolls, and ideas collided in ways that would shape centuries. Here, Christian teachers like Valentinus began to systematize Gnostic thought. They wrote of vast divine hierarchies called aeons, of realms within realms, of a pleroma, the fullness, from which all being flowed. Valentinus, trained in Platonic reasoning yet devoted to the message of Christ, taught that the material world was not the ultimate truth, but a distortion of it. Salvation came not by belonging to the church, but by understanding the cosmic story, how divine wisdom had fallen, how the world had been formed in her error, and how Christ came to restore harmony to the heavens. His message attracted followers across the empire, teachers, poets, and even some priests who felt the pull of his vision. Not all shared it. Other Christians viewed these ideas with alarm. To say the world was flawed was to question the Creator. To say knowledge, not faith, saved the soul, was to threaten the authority of bishops and apostles. Yet in these early decades, the boundaries were still soft. The Church had not yet defined what it meant to be orthodox. Councils and creeds were still centuries away. Debate was open, fierce, and often dangerous. But among those who sought Gnosis, there was little concern for power or politics. They were dreamers, mystics, philosophers. They wrote gospels filled with riddles and visions, Jesus laughing at the ignorance of the world, Mary Magdalene teaching secret wisdom to the disciples, cosmic beings unfolding from the one like ripples of light. To them, myth was not fantasy, it was a language for truths that logic could not hold. Still, secrecy became a habit. Their ideas were too strange for the public, too easily misunderstood. Meetings were held quietly, texts copied by trusted hands. Sometimes they were forced to destroy their own writings to avoid persecution. What survived was often hidden, passed between believers as precious treasure. In this era, to seek knowledge was an act of defiance. To say that truth came from within was to reject both empire and institution. And yet their faith was not rebellion for its own sake. It was a cry for meaning in a world that felt fallen. The world was becoming a labyrinth of gods, rulers, and suffering. For the Gnostic, that labyrinth was the illusion itself. To wake from it was salvation. And somewhere in Alexandria or Rome or Antioch, a young believer would sit beneath the stars, whispering a prayer not to the god of thunder or empire, but to the silent one beyond all names, asking only to remember. In a dim courtyard in Alexandria, under the same sky that had watched over pharaohs and philosophers, a group of disciples gather around a man named Valentinus. He does not preach of sin and punishment, nor of divine wrath. His words are soft, deliberate, almost poetic. He speaks of the pleroma, the fullness, where all divine existence dwells in harmony, a realm beyond space and time. From this silent, radiant perfection, emanations flow. Aeons, he calls them. Each one is an aspect of the divine, thought, truth, wisdom, light. Together they form the invisible architecture of the cosmos. One of these eons, he says, is Sophia, wisdom. In her desire to understand the unknowable source, she acts alone, reaching beyond her bounds. That act of yearning, pure but misguided, creates an imbalance. From her error emerges a being neither fully divine nor entirely void, the demiurge. Unaware of the higher realms, the demiurge looks upon himself as the only god and begins to fashion a universe. This, Valentinus explains, is the world we inhabit, beautiful in fragments, but flawed in essence. The students listen in awe. Some struggle to grasp it. Others weep quietly. For them, this myth does not contradict the story of Genesis. It completes it. The God who commands and punishes, who molds man from dust and banishes him from Eden, is not the ultimate creator, but a reflection of Sophia's mistake. The true Father remains hidden. beyond comprehension, beyond even being itself. To the Gnostics, this revelation explains everything the world refuses to justify. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does nature so full of beauty also destroy? Why does faith meant to liberate often enslave? The answer is not that the universe is evil, but that it is broken. It was crafted by a being who mistook ignorance for wisdom. Humanity, in this story, is a mixture of both worlds, divine light trapped in the clay of the demiurge. In their texts, the Gnostics give the demiurge many names: Yaldabaoth, Sackless, Samael. He is the arrogant craftsman, the architect of illusion, the god who says, "I am God and there is no other." But his very arrogance reveals his blindness. The true source remains hidden from him, as the sun is hidden from a cave. And yet, within the human soul, a spark of that hidden light still burns. This is where salvation begins, not in obedience, not in sacrifice, but in awakening. To be saved is to remember that you are more than flesh. The Gnostics did not fear death, for death was merely a shedding of the demiurge's illusion. What they feared was forgetfulness, living one's entire life asleep to the divine truth buried within. They describe this awakening through symbols, the tearing of a veil, the breaking of chains, the ascent of light through shadow. Their writings are dense with metaphor, not because they sought to confuse, but because ordinary language could not contain what they experienced. "Split a piece of wood and I am there," says Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. "Lift the stone and you will find me there." To them, Christ was not a distant saviour dying for the sins of the world, but a revealer of hidden knowledge, the one who remembered what the world had forgotten. Valentinus himself would later travel to Rome, where his teachings attracted both admirers and enemies. He nearly became bishop, historians say, before his ideas branded him dangerous. Yet his movement spread across Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, carrying with it a radical message that enlightenment, not authority, was the true path to God. In their gatherings, men and women spoke as equals. The divine was both masculine and feminine, for in the pleroma, every being existed in harmony with its counterpart. Sophia's fall was not shame but longing, an act of divine compassion that made creation possible. Her redemption, they believed, would come when all sparks returned to the light. The Gnostic teacher did not thunder from a pulpit. He asked questions that unsettled the soul. Who made the world you see? Who made the world within you? The answers were never given outright. Each seeker had to discover them through experience, meditation, and revelation. To follow Christ was not to worship his death, but to mirror his awakening, to see through the illusion of the material and recognize the divine in oneself. This teaching terrified the emerging church, for if the divine resided within, then priests were unnecessary. If salvation came through knowledge, then no single creed could contain it. The Gnostic did not seek forgiveness through rituals, they sought remembrance through awareness. Their faith was interior, personal and free, and freedom to any institution is dangerous. Still, for a time they flourished. The 2nd century was a golden age of spiritual experimentation. Scrolls passed from hand to hand, and secret hymns were sung beneath desert skies. Students copied parables from the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, and the Tripartite Tractate. Their pages spoke of realms of light and beings of harmony. Yet always, beneath the beauty, there was melancholy. The Gnostics knew that the world they lived in was hostile to such freedom. The church was organizing. Emperors were watching. For now, though, they taught and shared their visions. They believed that every revelation brought humanity closer to healing Sophia's wound. Every moment of understanding was a spark rising toward the fullness, and as their voices echoed through the early centuries, their cosmology grew into something both breathtaking and perilous. A faith that claimed to know not only how the world began, but why it had gone wrong. Soon others would call it heresy, but in these years of discovery, it was revelation. The Gnostics had dared to name the hidden architect of the world, and in doing so they set themselves on a path that would forever divide the followers of Christ. A winter storm rolls over the city of Rome. Inside a small candle-lit chamber near the Tiber, parchment pages are spread across a wooden table. The air smells of wax and damp stone. Two men argue softly. One, a presbyter aligned with the growing Orthodox community, the other, a quiet student of Valentinus. Between them lies a simple question: who is Christ? To the Orthodox teacher, Christ is the Son of God made flesh, born of a virgin, crucified, resurrected in body, the bridge between God and man. Salvation, he insists, comes through faith in his sacrifice and obedience to the church that guards his teachings, but the Valentinian disciple shakes his head. You speak of the outer form, he says, but not the hidden meaning. The Christ who died on the cross is the image of the divine that entered the world of matter to awaken it. His suffering was the descent of light into darkness, and his resurrection, the return of spirit to its true home. This moment, ordinary, almost invisible, is one of thousands happening across the Mediterranean world. Conversations like this would shape the future of Christianity. They were not battles of faith versus disbelief, but of interpretation. Was salvation an event that happened for humanity, or an awakening that happened within it? The Gnostics believed that Christ was not merely a saviour to be worshipped, but a revealer to be understood. He came not to establish institutions, but to teach recognition. In their texts, Jesus does not command, he explains. He does not demand worship, he invites awakening. If you bring forth what is within you, says the Gospel of Thomas, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring it forth, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This message redefined what it meant to follow him. To know Christ was to remember one's divine origin, to see beneath the illusion of flesh and fear the spark of the eternal. The crucifixion became symbolic, the imprisonment of light within matter. The resurrection became an inner event, the soul's ascent through ignorance toward Gnosis. Their Christ was not bound by history. He spoke through time, through visions and dreams, through the whisper of the insight. Some texts, like the Gospel of Mary, depict him revealing secret teachings to Mary Magdalene after his resurrection. She, not Peter, becomes the one who understands, yet her voice too would later be silenced by councils that feared what such a quality implied. The Gnostics spoke often of memory. Humanity, they said, was suffering from amnesia, a divine forgetfulness. Souls had fallen into the material world and forgotten their origin. The role of Christ was to remind them. His parables were not moral lessons, but maps. Each saying was a code for those with ears to hear. To the unawakened they were riddles, to the seeker they were keys. Their rituals reflected this inward turn. While the emerging church formalized baptism as a public initiation, the Gnostics saw it as a symbol of revelation, the washing away of ignorance. In the writings of the Valentinian teacher Theodotus, baptism is called the redemption, a moment when the believer becomes aware of the divine spark within. Other groups practice the bridal chamber ritual, a spiritual union of soul and spirit, symbolizing the restoration of cosmic harmony lost when Sophia fell. To outsiders, these ceremonies seemed secretive, even strange. Rumors spread that the Gnostics practiced sorcery, that they despised creation, that they lived in hidden sin. Most of it was false. They valued knowledge, not corruption, understanding, not denial, yet secrecy was necessary. Their myths inverted the accepted order of heaven and earth. To proclaim them openly was to invite condemnation. Still, some Gnostic teachers wrote with startling boldness. In the Gospel of Philip, the world is described as a deception. The world came into being through a mistake, for he who created it wanted to create it imperishable and immortal, but he fell short of attaining his desire. In the Apocryphon of John, the voice of Christ reveals to John that the creator of Genesis was not the true God at all, but Yaldabaoth, a lion-faced serpent, ignorant of the realms above him. For those who first heard these words, it was not blasphemy, it was liberation. The terror of divine punishment faded, replaced by the realization that fear itself was part of the illusion. The soul, not the body, was the true temple. The divine was not something to be approached from outside, but remembered from within. This vision drew poets, philosophers, and mystics. It appealed to those weary of violence and hierarchy, to those whose experience of the world could not be reconciled with a loving Creator. It offered meaning to suffering, not by denying it, but by placing it in a cosmic narrative of awakening. To suffer was to feel the friction between matter and spirit, to remember dimly that one does not belong entirely here, but in cities like Rome, where bishops sought unity above all, this was dangerous thinking. The Church's authority rested on the idea that salvation required mediation, through priests, through sacraments, through obedience. The Gnostics threatened to dissolve that authority by teaching that salvation was personal, direct, and inward. The confrontation was inevitable. Yet in these early decades it was still a whispering conflict, a contest of manuscripts, sermons, and hearts. And beneath it all, the question that began, it still lingered in the air. Who is Christ? To the Church, he was the Son who became man. To the Gnostics, he was the voice that reminded man of the divine. Two visions of the same Saviour destined to collide, each claiming to hold the true key to the kingdom within. Night falls over the Mediterranean. The waves break quietly along the shores of Egypt, carrying the scent of salt and desert wind. In the small port town of Nag Hammadi, scrolls are drying on reed mats after being copied by hand. Texts that speak of invisible realms, of divine light, of a God too vast for temples or kings. The copyists work by oil lamps, their eyes stinging, their ink fading into the papyrus like a secret being swallowed by time. It is here, and in places like it, that the rituals of light begin to take shape. The Gnostics never sought to rival the grandeur of the imperial church. They had no cathedrals, no gilded altars. Their gatherings were intimate, like circles of friends sharing a dangerous truth. They met in courtyards, in caves, sometimes by riverbanks at dawn. Their worship was not about hierarchy, it was about remembering. One might be baptized, but not in the name of sin's forgiveness. The ritual for them was an awakening. The water symbolized the boundary between the illusion of matter and the truth of spirit. As the initiate stepped into the river, the teacher whispered words drawn from the Gospel of Truth or the Tripartite Tractate. You are from the light, and to the light you shall return. The moment was quiet, almost fragile. When the believer emerged from the water, dripping and shivering under the rising sun, they believed they had crossed the line between sleep and remembrance. Music was rare, but silence was sacred. They preferred stillness to sound, meditation to chant. In that stillness, they imagined themselves ascending through the spheres, beyond the moon, beyond the planets, beyond the stars, to the realm of fullness where the Father dwelled. Each stage of their prayer corresponded to a layer of reality, a gate guarded by archons, beings of ignorance who kept souls trapped in matter. To pass through them, one had to know their names, their natures, and the secret words that revealed their illusion. These passwords were not magical incantations, but symbols of understanding. To know an archon was to see through its power. The bridal chamber was their most mysterious rite. It was not a literal marriage, though some critics accused them of that. It symbolized the reunion of the soul and spirit, the healing of the separation caused when Sophia fell from the divine realm. In the dim light of a secluded room, the initiate meditated on union with the divine counterpart, sometimes visualized as the Saviour himself. It was a mystical wedding, not of two bodies, but of what was human with what was eternal. When the rite ended, the participant often wept, not from sorrow but from a kind of recognition, as if they had glimpsed for a heartbeat their true home. Unlike the institutional church that was beginning to organize with strict hierarchies, the Gnostic groups were fluid, almost anarchic. A woman might teach men, a slave might instruct a merchant. They saw spiritual authority not in lineage, but in illumination. Those who had awakened were natural guides. Their power came from insight, not position. This radical equality was one of their quiet revolutions. In a world ruled by emperors and bishops, they taught that every human contained the same divine spark. The soul of a beggar was as radiant as that of a king. A woman's wisdom could mirror Sophia's own. Some texts, like the Gospel of Mary, portray Mary Magdalene as the disciple who truly understood Christ's revelation, yet in later centuries her voice would be buried under centuries of silence. To the Gnostics, however, her role was obvious. She represented the restored balance between masculine and feminine, matter and spirit, teacher and student. Their gatherings were intimate, often ending with shared bread and oil. The meal was symbolic, a remembrance not of Christ's death but of divine unity. When you eat, one teacher explained, you become what you take in. If you eat ignorance, you remain in darkness. If you eat knowledge, you become light. In these meals, they enacted what they believed, that the body could mirror the harmony of the divine when joined with understanding. To those outside their circles, these practices seemed cryptic, even dangerous. Bishops in Rome and Antioch whispered that the Gnostics mocked creation, that they hated life itself. But this was a misunderstanding. They did not despise existence. They pitied it. They saw the world not as evil, but as lost. Just as Sophia's fall had birthed a flawed creation, humanity too had fallen into forgetfulness. To awaken was to help the world remember what it was meant to be. In their teachings, there is an undertone of melancholy, a recognition that not everyone would awaken. The Gospel of Philip divides humanity into three types: the material, who cling to illusion, the psychic, who live by faith and emotion, and the pneumatic, the spiritual, who perceive the truth directly. This was not arrogance, but sorrow. The awakened could see how deeply others were trapped in the dream. To awaken meant to love more deeply, to grieve more profoundly, for one could no longer pretend that ignorance was peace. And yet, they believed that even in this broken world, the spark could be kindled again. Every act of compassion, every moment of genuine insight sent ripples back toward the pleroma. The task of the Gnostic was not to abandon the world, but to redeem it through remembrance. As the candles burned low, their teacher would close each gathering with a simple phrase that echoed across centuries. Do not let your flame go out in the winds of this world. You are not from here, you are from the light. The small group would disperse into the dark streets of the city, their faces calm, their hearts aflame. They had seen through the veil, if only for an instant, but their awakening was also a summons, and soon the powers of the world would notice. The smoke from temple fires drifts above the cities of the empire, curling into the night sky like a plea. No God will answer. It is the middle of the 2nd century, and Rome is tightening its grip, not just on its borders, but on ideas. The imperial world has grown weary of prophets and wanderers. To preserve order, both rulers and bishops are learning the same lesson. Unity is control, and diversity is danger. In this atmosphere, the church begins to crystallize. What had once been a movement of scattered believers now becomes an institution. Bishops rise in rank, creeds take form, heresy earns a name, and in this slow cementing of authority, the Gnostics find themselves pushed to the margins of the faith they once helped shape. In the year 180, a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon sits at his desk, his pen scraping against parchment. His mission is clear: to expose and defeat the teachers of false knowledge. His great work, Against Heresies, will become one of the most influential texts in early Christian history. With it, he builds the blueprint of orthodoxy. To Irenaeus, there is only one truth, and it is simple. God is good. The world he made is good. The church he founded through the apostles carries his authority. All else is deception. The Gnostics, he writes, are puffed up with knowledge falsely so called, seduced by serpents whispering secrets. He calls their myths absurd, stories of emanations, eons, and Sophia's fall. Yet ironically, it is through his denunciations that many of these myths will survive. The voices he sought to erase would echo through his own words. The Gnostics, meanwhile, continue to write. Their scrolls grow more intricate, their visions more daring, but each page feels heavier, as if they sense that history is beginning to close its hand around them. Rome is now the centre of a growing Christian authority, one that demands consistency, one good, one truth. The open debates of earlier decades are fading. To question the Church's narrative is to risk not only one's reputation, but one's life. Still, not all Gnostics retreat. Some engage in dialogue, hoping for reconciliation. Valentinus himself, once a respected teacher in Rome, appeals to reason. We do not reject the faith, he says, we seek to perfect it. But reason cannot survive long in the shadow of fear. His followers will later be branded heretics, his name erased from prayer books. Outside the walls of power, smaller sects scatter across the empire. The Sethians retreat into Egypt's deserts, where sand and silence become their cathedral. The Basilidians in Alexandria preserve their teachings through coded hymns, and a few desperate to protect their wisdom begin to bury their texts in clay jars, wrapping them carefully in linen to survive the centuries. As orthodoxy hardens, its image of Christ changes too. The suffering Jesus, crucified, resurrected, triumphant over sin, becomes the symbol of submission and redemption through obedience. For the Gnostics, this is tragedy. To them, Christ's message was not about kneeling before the divine, but becoming aware of it within oneself. Where the Church speaks of salvation through grace, the Gnostic speaks of salvation through awakening. Where the Church offers community, the Gnostic offers solitude. This difference of vision creates a cultural chasm. The Church grows outward, building structures, forming councils, gathering followers. The Gnostics grow inward, writing, meditating, preserving fragments of hidden knowledge. History will always favour the louder voice, and so, slowly, the quiet ones begin to disappear. In time, even persecution unites the Church. Under emperors like Marcus Aurelius and Septimius Severus, Christianity endures waves of violence. Martyrs die for the public faith, and their stories bind believers together. But the Gnostics, too secret to be celebrated, fade into the background. Their silence is mistaken for guilt, their secrecy for shame. The empire cannot tolerate ambiguity, neither can the institution that survives it. Yet even as they are hunted, the Gnostics' writings speak with an unbroken calm. The gospel of truth opens with words so serene that they could only have been written by those who had already made peace with loss. The gospel of truth is joy for those who have received from the Father of truth the grace of knowing him. To them, death was no end. The body was a vessel, and when it broke, the light escaped. Their enemies could burn scrolls, but they could not unlearn what had been remembered. Still, the pressure mounts. By the late 3rd century, what had once been diversity has become division. The word heretic enters law. Councils begin to define the canon, the collection of texts that will form the New Testament. Everything outside it is branded dangerous. The Gospels of Thomas, Mary, Philip, and others vanish from circulation, preserved only in secret or in fragments quoted by their critics. The Church, now intertwined with empire, emerges from persecution as a unified power. The Emperor Constantine, seeking stability, will soon declare Christianity not only legal but imperial. The irony is vast. The faith that began with rebels and mystics now finds itself aligned with throne and sword. And in the shadows of this triumph, the Gnostics make a final choice. They turn away, not in defiance but in quiet preservation. Their wisdom cannot win through argument, so it must survive through silence. In the deserts of Upper Egypt, their followers bury their manuscripts in clay jars, sealing them against time. Then they vanish into history, their voices replaced by the thunder of councils and creeds. But time has a way of remembering what power forgets. The sand will shift, the jars will endure, and one day when the world has grown weary of certainty, a farmer's shovel will break the silence. For now, though, the Gnostic age begins to dim. The light retreats beneath the earth, waiting for rediscovery. And above it all, the Church grows stronger. Its walls rising, its truth sealed, its mysteries simplified for the empire it now serves. The 4th century dawns beneath the banner of empire. Christianity, once hunted and scattered, now sits at the emperor's table. Constantine's conversion reshapes the world. Temples become churches, bishops become advisors, and the symbol of the cross rises above every conquered city. To many it feels like divine victory, but for those who had followed the path of Gnosis, it feels like exile. The Gnostics had sought God through revelation, silence, and inner light. The new Church seeks him through hierarchy, law, and creed. Where the Gnostics whispered that the divine spark dwells within each person, the bishops proclaim that salvation comes only through the institution, the one holy apostolic church. And when power finally embraces faith, diversity becomes a threat. The councils begin. Bishops gather in cities once hostile to their kind: Nicaea, Ephesus, Chalcedon. Inside marble halls lit by imperial torches, men in robes argue not about compassion or mysticism, but about definitions, about words like substance, nature, essence. The living mystery that had drawn seekers for centuries is reduced to formula. One truth, one creed, one God in three persons. The rest must fall silent. Outside these councils, the hidden communities watch the storm gather. They hear their names spoken with contempt: heretic, blasphemer, enemy of Christ. The same empire that once crucified their Saviour now speaks in his name, and the same machinery that once oppressed them turns against their own teachers. Libraries are seized, scrolls burned. A few, knowing what is coming, begin to hide what they can. In the desert monasteries of Egypt, a quiet resistance takes form. Not rebellion, but remembrance. Among them are those who still keep fragments of the old wisdom, pages of the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Pistis Sophia. They copy them in silence, knowing that each word might outlive them by centuries. Some bury them deep in jars sealed with tar, trusting that the earth will guard what humanity cannot. One such community near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif performs the act that will save their faith from extinction. They gather their manuscripts, wrap them in linen, and lower them into a clay vessel as tall as a child. A prayer is whispered, not for victory, but for survival. The jar is buried beneath the sand, beneath centuries of oblivion. They will never see it again. As centuries pass, memory collapses into myth. The church grows vast and ornate, spreading from Rome to Constantinople. Cathedrals rise filled with incense and power. The Gnostics are forgotten, their names surviving only in the writings of their enemies. To most they never existed at all, and yet faint echoes remain. In remote monasteries, hermits still speak of divine knowledge. In mystical sects of the Middle East, the language of light and darkness persists. In Europe, alchemists centuries later will use Gnostic symbols, the serpent, the spark, the union of opposites, without knowing where they came from. The divine seed buried in sand continues to germinate unseen. The age of silence stretches on. When the Roman Empire fractures and falls, the Church endures, armoured in doctrine, crowned in certainty. Its leaders quote Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine, men who wrote entire libraries defining truth by what it was not. And somewhere beneath the desert winds, the Gnostic texts sleep, untouched by conquerors or time. By the Middle Ages, even the word Gnostic has faded from memory. Yet, across Europe, new movements appear that feel eerily familiar. The Bogomils in the Balkans, the Cathars in France, the Manichaeans who blend Christian, Persian, and Gnostic thought. They all speak again of two worlds, one divine, one corrupt, of light imprisoned in matter, of salvation through understanding rather than obedience. The Church calls them heretics too, and the pattern repeats: suppression, persecution, fire. But truth, once born, is hard to erase. Beneath centuries of dogma and empire, the idea that divinity lies within the human soul endures like a spark hidden under ash. Even the great mystics of the Church, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, John of the Cross, speak in ways that sound suspiciously Gnostic. They talk of the inner birth of God, of the soul as a mirror of divine being, of knowledge as illumination. Officially, they are orthodox. Secretly, their visions speak the same language that once echoed in the caves of Egypt. For more than a millennium, the buried texts remain undisturbed. Empires rise and fall above them. Languages die. The desert reclaims entire civilizations. But under that silence the jar endures, waiting for the day when chance, not theology, will bring it back into the light. And then, one winter morning in 45, a man swings his pickaxe into the earth. He is not a scholar, not a priest, not a seeker of hidden wisdom. He is a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, searching for fertilizer near the cliffs outside Nag Hammadi. The blade strikes something hollow. He kneels, brushes away the dust, and finds a sealed clay jar. The jar has slept for nearly 1,600 years, and inside it, the forgotten voices of the first Christians wait to speak again. The farmer hesitates. The jar is nearly a metre tall, sealed with an old bowl of clay. He thinks of treasure, gold, jewels, something worth selling. But a whisper of fear chills him. Local superstition warns of jinn, spirits imprisoned in the earth, waiting for fools to set them free. He considers leaving it buried. Then greed wins over fear. He lifts a stone and strikes the seal. A dry hiss escapes. Just air. The exhalation of 16 centuries. Inside, wrapped in brittle papyrus and linen, lie 13 leather-bound codices. He cannot read the Selsimir letters, Coptic, the ancient Egyptian tongue of early Christians, but he knows they are old, older than anyone alive. The pages flake under his fingers, the ink fading into the fibres like whispers vanishing back into silence. He gathers them anyway, tying the books in cloth, and carries them home on his donkey. For weeks, the manuscripts sit beside his hearth, nearly burned for fuel. The farmer's mother, fearing curses, throws some pages into the fire before he stops her. The remaining texts survive by accident, a handful rescued from smoke and superstition. They will change everything we know about the birth of Christianity. Word spreads through the village. A local priest hears of the find, then a dealer, then a scholar. The pages pass from hand to hand, traded for money, food, and favours. In time, one codex finds its way to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. There, in a dimly lit archive, scholars begin to unfold the fragile pages, and history itself unfolds with them. Among the crumbling manuscripts are names no one has read for over 1,000 years. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth. Each begins with words that shimmer with familiarity and strangeness. In one, Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." In another, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, you will be known." The tone is serene, intimate, philosophical, so unlike the canonized Gospels that tell of miracles and law. There is no birth in Bethlehem, no trial before Pilate, no crucifixion. There is only dialogue, insight, and the recurring promise that salvation lies not in worship but in knowledge. For scholars, it is like hearing a lost language suddenly spoken again. The discovery at Nag Hammadi reveals that early Christianity was far more diverse than the Church ever admitted. These were not the ramblings of fringe heretics, but full spiritual systems, complete, coherent, and deeply mystical. They spoke of a Christ who revealed, not ruled, who guided souls inward, not upward. As translations begin in the 1950s, the implications ripple outward. Historians re-examine the first centuries of the Church. The line between orthodox and heretic begins to blur. What was once dismissed as blasphemy now reads as profound philosophy. The Gnostic idea of the divine spark inside humanity resonates with modern psychology, with existentialism, with mysticism itself. Even Carl Jung keeps a copy of the 7 Sermons to the Dead, a text modelled on ancient Gnostic thought, on his desk. For theologians, the shock is personal. The image of Christianity as a single unified revelation collapses. The early church had not one voice but many, a chorus of seekers, each trying to describe an encounter with the infinite. The canon we inherited was not inevitable. It was chosen, curated, enforced. The rest, the ones who dreamed differently, were buried in sand. Yet there is beauty in this rediscovery, not bitterness. The Gnostic texts are not bitter manifestos of rebellion. They are love letters to wisdom. In the Gospel of Truth, Christ speaks not of judgment but of joy. The Gospel of Truth is joy for those who have received from the Father of Truth the grace of knowing Him. This is not a God of wrath or law, but a God of memory and return. Humanity is not fallen, only lost. Salvation is not forgiveness, but recognition. As the pages are studied, translated, and published, they ignite new fascination in the modern world. Some call it a spiritual revolution. The rediscovery of the Gnostics feels like a mirror to our own century, an age disillusioned with authority, hungry for direct experience, yearning to believe that meaning lies within. not above. But this Renaissance is not without distortion. Popular culture will soon mix Gnosticism with fantasy, mysticism, and conspiracy. Films, novels, and movements will borrow its symbols, the false creator, the hidden truth, the awakening of the soul. But few will grasp the quiet heart of its message, that enlightenment is not rebellion, but remembrance. Still, in academic halls and monasteries, the rediscovered words continue to breathe. Scholars carefully separate myth from myth-making, translating line by fragile line. Each codex becomes a bridge between the seekers of the past and the skeptics of the present, between the faith that ruled and the faith that remembered. The Church, centuries older and now unchallenged, cannot undo what has been unearthed. For the first time in history, the suppressed voices of early Christianity speak again, not as enemies, but as witnesses. They remind the world that faith was never monolithic, that belief was born in diversity, and that truth can survive even under 16 centuries of sand. As the sun sets over the Nile that year, one of the translators places his hand gently on a page from the Gospel of Thomas. The ink still faintly shines under the lamplight. "These words," he whispers, "have waited for us." And somewhere across time, perhaps the Gnostics themselves, those seekers of light, would smile. The silence had finally broken. The spark had risen from the dust once more. In the years that follow, the discovery at Nag Hammadi ripples quietly across the world of scholarship like a stone cast into deep water. Universities from Cairo to Paris to Princeton request copies of the manuscripts. The old Egyptian Coptic, once nearly forgotten, is revived by linguists determined to preserve every stroke and syllable. The fragile papyrus, darkened by time and sand, is placed under glass, its ink still bearing the fingerprints of the ancient scribes who once copied it by candlelight. For historians, it is as if a missing chapter of humanity's spiritual evolution has been found. For theologians, it is a question that refuses to be silenced. And for seekers, those restless hearts in every age, it is a whisper that feels strangely familiar, like remembering a dream long forgotten. By the 60s, the first complete translations appear. The Gospel of Thomas stuns readers with its simplicity and depth. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many echoing the canonical Gospels, others entirely new. No miracles, no crucifixion, only riddles, parables, and a single guiding theme. That the kingdom of God is not a place to enter, but a truth to awaken within. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. To some it is beautiful, to others dangerous. Theologians debate whether these words were ever spoken by Jesus himself, or whether they were written generations later by visionaries who reimagined him. But regardless of origin, they reveal something undeniable, that the first centuries of Christianity were far more alive, more experimental, and more uncertain than anyone had dared to believe. In seminar rooms and monasteries alike, the old categories, orthodox, heretic, begin to feel small. The rediscovered texts show that what we now call heresy was once part of the same vibrant conversation about what it meant to be human, divine, and awake. Where later doctrine saw sin these writings saw forgetfulness. Where orthodoxy demanded faith, they invited exploration. The 20th century is, in many ways, ready for this rediscovery. The world is weary of dogma. Wars have shattered certainty. Technology has dissolved boundaries. The Gnostic's central insight, that the world's rulers often confuse power with truth, that appearances conceal deeper realities, resonates with a new generation disillusioned by politics and propaganda. To question authority is no longer blasphemy, it is survival. Artists and thinkers begin to borrow their language. Philosophers like Hans Jonas compare Gnosticism to modern existentialism. Both describe a soul adrift in an alien universe, seeking meaning in a world that feels mechanical and cold. Carl Jung, fascinated by Gnostic symbolism, writes that these ancient myths mirror the structure of the human psyche, The fall of Sophia becomes the story of the unconscious mind yearning to reunite with its source. Even literature and cinema begin to echo Gnostic patterns, worlds revealed to be illusions, protagonists awakening to hidden truths, redemption through knowledge rather than obedience. Though the names change, matrix instead of pleroma, code instead of spirit, the pattern remains. Humanity, it seems, keeps dreaming the same dream, that behind every wall of reality lies another, waiting to be seen. But the real revolution is quieter. Within theology itself, scholars like Elaine Pagels, Gilles Quispel, and Jean Dorès begin to rebuild history with humility. They do not seek to dethrone the Bible or destroy belief, but to expand it, to show that Christianity was never a single stream, but a river with many branches. Pagels writes, "By silencing the Gnostics, the Church lost a language of experience, one that taught believers to find God within themselves." Her work awakens millions to the possibility that doubt and faith are not enemies, but partners in the same search. The Gnostic rediscovery also gives voice to those the ancient Church had silenced most: women. The Gospel of Mary reveals Mary Magdalene not as a sinner, but as a teacher, a confidant of Christ who receives visions denied to the male disciples. When Peter questions her, she answers calmly, "Do you think that I have invented this myself, or that I am lying about the Saviour?" For centuries her voice had been erased. Now, across the modern world, readers hear it again, and wonder how history might have changed had she been allowed to speak. Still, not everyone welcomes these revelations. The official Church regards the Nag Hammadi texts with caution. To them, these are not new Gospels, but ancient misunderstandings, a window into the confusion of early believers, not a replacement for divine truth. But even that concession is monumental. For the first time, institutional faith must acknowledge that it was built upon choice, that certain voices were amplified and others buried. As the decades pass, the Gnostic scriptures find their way into classrooms, meditation circles, and even bedside tables. Their language feels strangely modern. Light and shadow, ignorance and awakening, illusion and truth. Each reading feels less like learning and more like remembering. Their authors, long dead, seem to speak across centuries to every person who has ever felt that something sacred was hidden behind the ordinary. In this sense, the Nag Hammadi discovery is not just about history, it is about recognition. The realization that what was once labelled heresy was, in truth, an expression of the same human hunger that gave birth to every faith, the desire to know. Not to be told, not to be commanded, but to see firsthand the light that the world tries to hide. And so the Gnostics rise again, not as a religion, not as a rebellion, but as a reminder, a whisper from the past that says, the truth has never been one voice speaking downward, but countless voices calling upward from within. Under museum glass, the papyrus still breathes faintly. You can almost see the faint shimmer of ink where a long-dead hand wrote, "Whoever finds the meaning of these words will not taste death." The spark that had waited under desert sand for 16 centuries has found its air again, and once more, it burns. The rediscovery of the Gnostic texts changes not only how we understand Christianity, but how we understand ourselves. For centuries, faith had been a structure, something built from the outside in, defined by what one must believe. But the Gnostics offered a mirror instead of a wall. Their message was not follow, but look. And as the 20th century deepens into the 21st, that mirror begins reflecting modern humanity with unsettling clarity. The Gnostic vision that divine truth is hidden within, that the world of appearances is not the ultimate reality, finds new life in a culture drowning in information but starving for meaning. We have mapped galaxies, sequenced genomes, and built machines that think, yet the same question that stirred the deserts of Egypt still echo in our minds. Who are we? Why is the world broken? What part of us remembers the light? In universities, new fields of study emerge. Comparative mysticism, psychological theology, mythic philosophy, scholars trace parallels between ancient Gnosis and modern disciplines, neuroscience's exploration of consciousness, physics' struggle to define reality, psychoanalysis's descent into the hidden self. What the Gnostics expressed in myth, the spark trapped in matter, the higher self asleep inside flesh, now finds resonance in science's own metaphors of hidden dimensions and quantum uncertainty. But beyond academia, the emotional core of Gnosticism begins to awaken in ordinary people. In an age where organised religion often feels rigid or commercialised, the Gnostic vision offers something deeply personal, the belief that enlightenment is not a reward granted by institutions, but a birthright discovered through awareness. Meditation teachers quote the Gospel of Thomas beside the words of the Buddha. Spiritual seekers see Sophia's fall as the archetype of human longing, her redemption as the healing of the collective soul. Yet the revival is not free of distortion. In bookstores and online forums, Gnosticism becomes a fashionable label, part mysticism, part conspiracy, part rebellion. Some invoke it to justify cynicism, mistaking its cosmic melancholy for despair. Others mix it with modern mythologies, turning the demiurge into a symbol for political corruption or digital control. The original heart of the tradition, its yearning for awakening through compassion and understanding, gets lost amid slogans about hidden knowledge. But even this confusion echoes the ancient pattern. The Gnostics themselves had warned that knowledge without humility leads only to another prison. True Gnosis, they wrote, is not pride, but remembrance, a quiet seeing of things as they are. Among theologians, debates grow gentler, more reflective. The once bitter divide between orthodoxy and Gnosticism softens into dialogue. Theologians begin to admit that the Gnostic texts, while not canonical, carry a poetry of insight that enriches faith rather than opposes it. Even some priests quote the Gospel of Mary in sermons about grace, using its vision of divine intimacy to speak to congregations tired of fear-based faith. In 2003, when the Gospel of Judas is published, a text found decades earlier but only fully restored in the new millennium, the shock repeats. Its pages reveal Judas not as traitor but as confident, the disciple who obeyed Jesus' secret command to free him from the prison of flesh. The public response is electric. Television specials debate whether the church hid the truth. Scholars, however, see something deeper, a reminder that every story has another side and that even betrayal may hide revelation. The conversation expands beyond religion. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers draw on Gnostic imagery. The fallen Sophia, the false world, the awakening soul, the Matrix trilogy, Blade Runner, The Truman Show, even the haunting stories of Philip K. Dick, all bear the fingerprints of Gnostic thought. Their characters awaken to the illusion of the world, defy its false gods, and seek the real beneath the real. The demiurge has become digital, but the longing is the same. In psychology, Carl Jung's disciples find new meaning in the rediscovered texts. They see Sophia's fall not as cosmic tragedy, but as the story of the human psyche losing and rediscovering balance. Jung himself once wrote that the Gnostics knew the soul, and he meant it literally. They understood that salvation begins not in heaven, but in the heart. And perhaps this is why the Gnostics feel more relevant now than ever. In a century defined by disconnection, between body and spirit, technology and emotion, wealth and purpose, their voice returns like an ancient echo saying, "The kingdom is within you." Their myth of exile mirrors our alienation in a world of constant noise. Their belief in hidden truth reflects our search for authenticity in a culture of illusion. But even now they remain elusive. The more we read them, the more they seem to speak in paradoxes. Their texts resist certainty. Their language dissolves boundaries between myth and metaphor. They remind us that knowledge is not possession, but participation. To know is to awaken, not to own. In a museum in Cairo, one of the Nag Hammadi codices still rests behind glass. Its pages are cracked, its letters fading into dust. Tourists pass by quickly, unaware that the fragile ink before them once divided an Maos, an empire of souls. But if you stop, if you look closely, you can still see the care in each stroke, the work of a believer who copied not for fame, not for argument, but for remembrance. You can almost imagine that scribe centuries ago pausing between lines, gazing out into the desert night. The stars above him are the same ones we see today. He dips his pen into ink and writes words he hopes will never be lost. Light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. And in that moment, across time, across creed, the circle closes. The Gnostic spark that once defied empire and dogma still flickers, not in temples or institutions, but wherever a human being dares to ask. What if the divine was never far away? What if it was inside us all along? The silence that followed their suppression has ended. The light they sought still moves quietly through the world, hidden, humble and alive. Even as the 21st century unfolds, the rediscovery of the Gnostics continues to shift from history into lived philosophy. What began as an archaeological revelation has become a mirror for the modern soul, a reflection of our struggle between knowing and believing, between seeing and obeying. In lecture halls, monasteries, and even on digital screens, the same conversation returns in new forms. Podcasts analyse the Apocryphon of John beside neuroscience papers on consciousness. Artists reinterpret Sophia as a symbol of ecological grief and divine wisdom crying through a wounded planet. Tech thinkers speak of escaping the simulation, unaware that their metaphors echo ancient fears of the demiurge's false creation. The language changes, the longing does not. For some, the Gnostic message becomes an antidote to despair. In a world where truth is fractured and institutions seem hollow, the idea that the spark of divinity still lives within each person offers quiet hope. It teaches that awakening is possible without apocalypse, that revelation can happen in the stillness of thought, not in the spectacle of power. For others, it is a challenge, a call to take responsibility for one's own soul, to stop searching for saviours and start listening for memory. Modern spirituality fractures along familiar lines. Some pursue Gnosis through study and meditation, blending Christian mysticism with Eastern insight. Others drift toward isolation, mistaking the Gnostics' inward gaze for withdrawal from the world. But the ancient texts warn against that very temptation. They insist that remembrance does not end in solitude, it overflows into compassion. To see the divine in oneself is to see it everywhere. Among scholars, the work of translation never ends. Each decade brings new fragments, new interpretations, new debates. The fragile pages of Nag Hammadi are digitized, allowing anyone with an internet connection to read what emperors once feared. The distance between monastery and modernity collapses. A reader in Tokyo or Sao Paulo can open the Gospel of Thomas on a screen and hear, across 2 millennia, the same quiet voice. There is light within a person of light, and it shines on the whole world. If it does not shine, there is darkness. That single sentence becomes a thread through time, from ancient Egypt's hidden chambers to today's cities of glass and noise. It carries the same promise the first Gnostics felt in their hearts, that ignorance, no matter how vast, is temporary, that every soul remembers something eternal. Even the Church, changed by centuries of history, approaches these texts with more humility now. A few theologians suggest that the Gnostics may not have been enemies, but early explorers who wandered too far into mystery. Some monasteries quietly study the sayings of Thomas beside the canonical Gospels, not to replace them, but to understand the depth of faith's diversity. It is a reconciliation through remembrance, not agreement, but respect. Meanwhile, the myths themselves keep evolving. Sophia's fall becomes a symbol for humanity's own separation from the sacred, our exile into material obsession and digital distraction. Her redemption mirrors our collective hope, that by remembering what we truly are, we might heal the world we've broken. Imagine standing again where it all began, the cliffs of Nag Hammadi, the desert stretching endless under the Egyptian sun. The sand still hides fragments of forgotten prayers, the wind hums through the rocks like breath. Somewhere beneath your feet lie traces of those who copied, carried, and concealed the words that refused to die. you realize that what they preserved was never just parchment or ink. It was a way of seeing. The Gnostics did not ask the world to believe them. They asked it to wake up. Their story of divine exile, of hidden light, of remembrance, is not finished. It unfolds every time a human being pauses amid the noise and asks, what is real? Perhaps that is why their legacy endures. It does not demand allegiance. It invites discovery. It whispers that faith and knowledge are not rivals, but reflections of the same truth, one reaching upward, the other inward. As dusk settles over the desert, you can almost feel the weight of 1,600 years lift from the buried jar. The spark they guarded has already escaped, carried now in countless minds and languages. It flickers in study halls, meditation rooms, quiet bedrooms, and crowded streets, wherever someone dares to question the world and listen for the silence beneath it. The Gnostics are gone, their names erased, their temples dust. Yet the light they sought still travels, unseen, unclaimed, unending. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you might feel it too, that faint familiar warmth deep within, whispering the same secret they once risked everything to keep, that the divine was never above you, it was always within. The night sky stretches over the Nile valleys like a vast living tapestry. The stars shimmer in patterns that the ancients once believed were messages, divine reminders that heaven still remembers us. The air is still and the desert sleeps, but somewhere the last echoes of a prayer rise, a voice not of worship but of remembrance. This is where the story circles back, not to its beginning but to its eternal centre. For all the centuries of chants, the walls of words, the buried jars, the councils and the rediscoveries, the Gnostics' central truth remained simple and terrifying. The light was never gone, only forgotten. They had taught that ignorance, not evil, was the world's greatest shadow. The demiurge, that blind craftsman who mistook himself for God, was not a monster from myth, but a symbol of arrogance, of every age that confuses power for wisdom, law for truth, form for essence. And in our own time, we can still see his reflection in the systems that promise order but breed emptiness, in the institutions that speak of salvation but forget compassion, in the endless noise that drowns the quiet voice inside. To read the Gnostic texts today is not merely to study history, it is to face a mirror. When we read the Gospel of Thomas saying, "If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you," it feels less like theology and more like prophecy. It is a reminder that forgetfulness, spiritual or human, is the slowest kind of death. The rediscovered pages now live in climate-controlled rooms, their fibres preserved, their ink stabilised. But the truth they carry cannot be contained. It moves through classrooms and cathedrals, through quiet readers on sleepless nights. It invites each person to reenact the same journey that the ancient seekers once made. The turning inward, the shattering of illusion, the recognition of the divine spark. And yet, the Gnostic vision was never an escape from the world. It was a reconciliation with it. They did not teach that matter was to be hated, but that it was to be seen through. The world is not a prison if we awaken within it. It becomes a school, a mirror, a chrysalis for the spirit. Even Sophia, whose fall began the cosmic tragedy, does not remain fallen. Her longing becomes her redemption. Her mistake becomes the bridge through which the divine learns compassion. That is the paradox the Gnostics left us. The very flaw of creation becomes its hope. Through brokenness, we remember the unbroken. Through ignorance, we begin to seek. Through darkness, we learn the value of light. Centuries ago, their enemies burned their scrolls, believing that the fire would erase their heresy. But perhaps, in some strange irony, the flames only completed the symbol. For fire, too, is light, an imperfect mirror of the very truth they guarded. And like that light, their message has endured, flickering, fragile, yet indestructible. Now, in an age defined by both enlightenment and exhaustion, the Gnostics speak again, not in thunder, but in whispers. Their gospel does not promise heaven. It promises awareness. It asks for nothing but attention. It tells us that salvation was never somewhere else, waiting in the clouds or in temples, but hidden in the human capacity to see clearly, love deeply, and remember who we are. So imagine for a moment that same jar, sealed, forgotten, buried beneath the Egyptian sand. The man who broke it open could not have known what he was freeing. He might have thought he was stealing from the past, but perhaps he was delivering the future. Inside that jar was not just parchment, it was possibility. It was the reminder that truth, once spoken, cannot die. It only sleeps until we are ready to hear it again. And now, as the story closes, you are part of that same unfolding. The question that began in candlelight 2,000 years ago, who is Christ, who are we, has not ended. It is still being asked not by theologians or empires, but by every human being who dares to look inward and see a spark of the eternal looking back. You do not need to call it Gnosis. You do not need to name it faith. You need only to remember, as they once did, that there is something within you older than the stars, quieter than fear, and brighter than every sun combined. That is what the Gnostics died for. That is what the farmer unknowingly freed, and that is what you, even now, carry. So let the world keep turning in its noise and confusion. Let the sands shift. Let the empires rise and fall. Somewhere within the endless motion, the same truth remains unmoved, ancient, silent, and luminous. The light is within you, and when you finally see it, you will remember. It had been waiting there all along. The wind moves softly across the desert ruins, stirring a few grains of sand over the threshold of an abandoned monastery. The walls are broken, the paint long faded, but faint lines of ink still cling to the plaster. Traces of copied words, prayers, perhaps fragments of Gnostic hymns. The world that once feared these teachings has forgotten them again, and yet they never truly vanish. For the story of the Gnostics was never about survival through strength. It was about persistence through memory. Empires fall, languages die, dogmas harden and crumble, but memory endures in the quietest places, a sentence in an old book, a question in a restless mind, a feeling that the visible world is not all there is. Today, in libraries and monasteries, digital archives and whispered circles of study, their voice continues. It does not seek converts, it does not demand confession, it waits, patient as ever, for those who are ready to hear, for those who sense, however faintly, that something luminous hides beneath the noise of ordinary life. Modern theologians often call the Gnostics the religion of seekers. It was not a faith of destination but of journey, each human soul a traveller between ignorance and insight, between the shadow and the light that cast it. The world, they said, was not a curse but a lesson. The pain of separation was the price of remembrance. Every injustice, every sorrow, every act of beauty was a thread leading back to the source. And so, as centuries stretch toward eternity, the Gnostic idea becomes not a religion, but a rhythm, an inner pulse that reappears wherever humanity hungers for meaning beyond the visible. It shows itself in the mystics who pray in silence rather than chant aloud, in the poets who speak of light inside darkness, in the scientists who look into the nature of reality and glimpse mystery instead of certainty. It survives in the moment a person staring at the night sky feels that the stars are not above them but within them. It survives in the hush before dawn when one recognizes that awareness itself, the capacity to wonder, is holy. The Gnostics called this moment anamnesis, remembrance, not of doctrines but of origin, not of facts but of being. In their vision, all awakening begins with remembering that the separation between God and human, between matter and spirit, between life and eternity was never real. It was only a veil woven by forgetfulness. Their legacy is not rebellion, it is restoration. It invites humanity to see through division, religious, cultural, personal, and to recognize that every soul, however lost, carries a spark of the same flame. This was the meaning of the pleroma, the fullness, that creation was not meant to be a battlefield between light and dark, but a reunion of them. Perhaps that is why, even now, the Gnostic story continues to return whenever the world grows too loud, whenever institutions grow too certain, whenever the human heart feels too far from its own centre. For the myth of Sophia, the divine wisdom who fell and rose again, was never merely a cosmic allegory, it was a mirror. She falls still, every day, in every act of ignorance, in every moment we forget our source, and she rises again every time we forgive, every time we seek truth without pride, every time we see another person and recognize something sacred behind their eyes. The Gnostics would say that the story never ended because the awakening is still happening, not in cathedrals or temples, but in the heart of each conscious being that begins to remember. And so the desert waits. The papyrus decays, the ink fades to dust, but the light, unwritten, unseen, undying, moves from mind to mind, from age to age. It is carried not by conquerors but by seekers. It asks for nothing but awareness. It promises nothing but truth. If you listen carefully, you might hear it even now, not as a voice, but as a vibration at the edge of silence. You are from the light, and to the light you shall return. The words that once travelled on parchment now travel through breath, through thought, through being itself. And so the story of the Gnostics closes where it began, not in dogma, but in wonder. The jar is empty now, the pages rest, the world continues, but the spark, the eternal, indivisible spark, remains. It lives in you, and it remembers, far from Egypt's sands, under the cold glow of modern streetlights. The story of the Gnostics continues to unfold, not as a religion reborn, but as a quiet current beneath the noise of the age. You can find traces of it almost anywhere if you know how to look. In the meditations of monks who speak of the inner Christ, in the poetry of those who say light is born through suffering, in the hum of a philosopher's lecture about consciousness and illusion. The Gnostic spirit is less a creed than a posture, an awareness that there is more to see than what is seen, more to know than what can be told, and so it adapts, slipping through centuries, reappearing wherever hearts begin to ask, what if the divine never left? In our time, this spirit speaks through a new language. Scientists describe the fabric of the universe as energy vibrating through unseen dimensions. Mystics hear in that vibration the echo of the pleroma. Psychologists map the unconscious mind and call it the hidden architecture of the soul. Gnostics would nod, for they too believed in inner worlds layered like heavens. Even technology, our vast web of code and simulation, unwittingly mirrors their myths. Worlds built by flawed creators, humanity awakening to realize it is trapped inside a design of its own making. Yet the Gnostic message remains the same. The true journey is inward. The false gods are not emperors or machines, but the illusions we mistake for truth, wealth, power, fear, pride. The demiurge still reigns whenever the outer world blinds us to the inner, and Sophia still falls every time wisdom is replaced by noise, but always there is the possibility of return. That was the Gnostics' final secret, not that humanity was condemned to exile, but that awakening was inevitable. They believed every soul would eventually remember its origin, just as every spark must return to the fire. Even the demiurge, they said, would one day see his own blindness and be redeemed by the light he once resisted. It is a vision both radical and tender, a universe in which nothing is truly lost, not the scrolls burned by emperors, not the seekers erased by history, not even the shadows within the human heart. Every darkness, they taught, is simply light not yet remembered. So the story ends, or perhaps begins again, wherever someone, alone at her night beneath stars or city lamps, feels that quiet stirring, that sense that they have been here before, that the world is not foreign but forgotten. They close their eyes, and for a breathless instant they remember. The walls of illusion tremble, the veil thins, and in that space between silence and realization, the Gnostic story lives once more, not as myth, not as rebellion, but as awakening. A whisper older than scripture, softer than prayer and brighter than fire. The light is within you. It always was, and it is waiting to be remembered. Dawn rises over the same desert that once guarded the secret jars. The first light touches the cliffs, and the stones turn gold again, as if the earth itself remembers what it once hid. A few kilometers away, the Nile glimmers in silence, flowing as it always has, past empires, past gods, past faiths that rose and fell like waves. The river carries no judgment, only memory. In that golden stillness, you begin to understand why the Gnostics chose this land as their refuge. The desert holds two kinds of silence, one that buries and one that preserves. For 1600 years it did both. Beneath the dunes it kept their word safe. Above them it reminded anyone who passed that truth cannot be destroyed, only forgotten for a time. When the farmer broke open the jar, he was not simply unearthing history. He was performing a ritual that had been waiting for him since the moment those manuscripts were sealed. He released a truth that humanity had buried, not because it was false, but because it was too free. The world has always feared freedom that begins inside, and yet here we are again. The same questions, the same longing, the same light trying to find its way through the dust. The Gnostic story does not end with discovery. It begins with recognition. It begins every time someone stops mistaking belief for knowledge and obedience for understanding. It begins every time a person looks inward and dares to see not sin, but divinity staring back. The Church built cathedrals to touch heaven. The Gnostics built nothing, believing heaven was already here, hidden in sight, trapped in matter, waiting to awaken. They left no monuments, but they left a map. Not one drawn on parchment, but inscribed in human nature. The path of remembrance, the journey from illusion to knowing. And if you listen now, past the hum of cities, past the static of screens, past the endless noise of the world, you can still hear what they heard. A hum beneath reality, a presence in every breath, a light behind every shadow. That is where their story ends, not in history but in experience, not in words but in awareness. For all the centuries of suppression and rediscovery, their message was always meant for this moment, for you, standing at the edge of time, between forgetting and remembering. You do not need to go to Nag Hammadi. You do not need to read ancient copies. You need only to pause, to breathe, and to look within the silence. The same spark that once lit the minds of those forgotten seekers still burns there. It always has. The desert will one day reclaim their tombs. The papyrus will crumble. Even the ink will fade into dust. But the light, unwritten, unowned, unending, will go on. And when humanity is ready to remember again, it will rise once more, just as it did from that sealed jar shimmering through sand and time, whispering across every heart the same quiet truth. The divine was never lost. It was only waiting to be seen. Evening descends again over the world, and the light fades from the sky the way memory fades from the mind, slowly, reluctantly, with one last glimmer of gold before the blue. In a museum half a world away from that desert, the Nag Hammadi codices rest under a sheet of protective glass. Visitors shuffle past without stopping, unaware that behind that thin pane lies the breath of an entire forgotten world. The ink is faint now, brown and brittle. The parchment cracks when handled. Yet what it carries has outlived kingdoms. Every letter is a bridge across time, a voice that refused to die. If you lean close enough, you can almost feel the pulse of the hands that wrote it. Someone hunched over by lamplight, knowing that what they were copying might cost them everything, but writing anyway. That quiet defiance, that faith in the endurance of truth is what carries the Gnostics into eternity. Their words survive not because they were protected by power, but because they were preserved by longing. They were written by those who loved the mystery more than safety, by those who believed that a single spark of understanding could illuminate centuries of darkness. And perhaps that is why their voice still reaches us. The modern world is drowning in noise, yet emptier than ever. We have more information than any age before us, but less wisdom. We chase light on screens while forgetting the light within. The Gnostics would have called this the perfect illusion. the world convincing us that knowledge is accumulation rather than awakening. But their teachings cut through time with a quiet clarity. They tell us that truth is not collected, it is uncovered. That we are not vessels waiting to be filled, but mirrors waiting to remember what we already reflect. That enlightenment is not ascent to the heavens, but descent into the self, into the stillness where all things meet. Somewhere, a monk in a mountain hermitage opens a translation of the Gospel of Truth. Somewhere else, a scientist studying consciousness writes of the observer behind the thought. Somewhere, a poet puts down their pen and simply breathes, aware for the first time that awareness itself is holy. The same current moves through all of them. They are modern children of the same hidden lineage. The eternal fraternity of those who seek to see. The Gnostics would have smiled at this continuity. They never wanted a religion to conquer the world. They wanted a world to remember itself. And slowly, quietly it does. Every act of compassion is Sophia rising again. Every honest question is a rebellion against the demiurge of ignorance. Every moment of awareness is a spark returning home. Night deepens, the museum closes. The lights dim over the glass cases that hold the manuscripts. But outside, under the same stars that once watched over Egypt, people walk through city streets, their reflections glimmering in windows, their faces lit by passing headlights. None of them think of ancient scrolls or buried jars. Yet the same light those Gnostics spoke of flickers behind every pair of eyes. It does not need to be named to exist. It does not need to be worshipped to be real. It only waits for recognition. And in that moment, when a single person pauses, feels the weight of their breath, senses the faint pulse of something infinite moving beneath the surface of the ordinary, the story begins again. That is the true immortality of the Gnostics. Not that their words endured, but that their question never stopped echoing. Who are we? Why do we forget? And what happens when we remember? The sand, the statues, the ink, the silence, all answer together. You were never lost. You were only asleep. And the light was waiting. ChatGPT. Far from the desert, far from the cracked jars and fading ink, life moves as it always has. Cities glowing, planes crossing the night sky, voices rising and falling in the endless murmur of the world. Yet somewhere within that noise, the same silence persists. It hides behind the hum of machines, beneath the rhythm of hearts, inside every breath drawn without awareness. The Gnostics would have called it the hidden fullness, the pleroma shining beneath the illusion of chaos. If you could strip away the noise of civilization for just one heartbeat, you might feel it too. The hum beneath all things, the faint pulse of an intelligence that is not above or outside, but within. It is not a god watching from the clouds. It is the spark inside every living being that remembers what the rest of us have forgotten. The world has grown more complex, but the questions remain painfully simple. Why do we build so much and feel so empty? Why, with all our progress, do we still feel so far from peace? The Gnostics would have smiled gently at our confusion. They would say that the world itself has not changed. It has only built higher walls between us and what is real. The same forces they spoke of still govern our age. Ignorance disguised as wisdom, control masquerading as order, blindness enthroned as certainty. They called those forces archons, not demons, but patterns, fear, pride, greed, distraction. The systems that keep humanity asleep by convincing us that the cage is home. To awaken, the Gnostics taught, was not to destroy the world, but to see through it, to recognize the illusion for what it is, and to walk through it with eyes open. Every age has its own form of the demiurge. For them it was empire and dogma. For us it is the screen, the algorithm, the endless scroll that consumes attention and offers nothing in return. Yet even now the cure is the same. Remembrance. To remember is to rebel, not violently but inwardly. It is to reclaim the small flame of consciousness that the world keeps trying to extinguish. When you remember, the world loses its power over you, not because you escape it, but because you see it as it truly is. You begin to move differently, speak differently, love differently. Awareness becomes your prayer. And so the Gnostic story continues, not in deserts or monasteries, but in living rooms, in train cars, in crowded subways where someone suddenly looks up from their phone and wonders, what am I doing here? That fleeting awareness, that half second of clarity, is the same awakening those ancient seekers lived and died for. They would have said, that is the spark. You do not have to reject the world to see through it. You only have to look honestly, to see the divine not as something separate, but as the life moving through everything you touch, the breath in your lungs, the warmth of another's hand, the stillness between thoughts. That is the quiet revolution of Gnosis, not the overthrow of rulers, but the remembering of truth. The realization that heaven was never above us, and hell never below, but both are states of sight, how clearly or how dimly we see the world and ourselves, and perhaps that is why the story refuses to end, because every generation forgets again, and every generation remembers again. The cycle of ignorance and awakening is the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Sophia's eternal fall and return were replayed in the life of every soul that opens its eyes. The manuscripts sleep behind glass, the scholars move on to other subjects, but the living text remains unwritten, the one written in you line by line as you begin to remember. For the Gnostics, salvation was never about escaping the world, it was about awakening within it, and in this moment, as you read, as you breathe, as the awareness inside you stirs ever so slightly, it happens again. The story continues, the spark awakens, the light remembers its name, and for an instant, brief, eternal, you do too. The air of dawn returns, soft, pale, almost weightless. The first light brushes the roofs of cities and the ridges of mountains alike, reminding the world that another cycle has begun. Somewhere a child wakes to the sound of morning traffic. Somewhere else an old man opens his eyes in a hospital bed. Somewhere a monk watches the same light creep across the floor of his cell. None of them know it, but they are part of the same quiet revelation. Because if the Gnostics were right, the divine does not reveal itself through miracles or angels or thunder. It reveals itself through awareness, through the simple act of being. Every sunrise, every breath, every heartbeat is a message from the source saying, I am still here. You are still mine. In the early centuries, they wrote that the divine spark sleeps within the flesh, dreaming that it is human. But awakening does not mean leaving the dream. It means realizing that the dreamer and the dream are one. The light within does not flee from the world. It illuminates it from the inside. That was the secret the bishops feared, and the empire could not control. A faith that required no mediator, no permission, no temple other than consciousness itself. And so the myth of the fall of Sophia becomes a prophecy for every age. She is wisdom that descended into shadow, not to be punished, but to bring light into darkness. Her story is ours, the forgetting of what we are, and the long return to remembrance. When the Gnostics sang her hymns, they were not worshipping a goddess, they were honouring the part of themselves that still strives to rise through confusion toward clarity, through separation toward reunion. The modern world gives her many names now. Some call her mind, some call her spirit, some call her love. But whatever the language, she is the same pulse of longing that moves through everything that lives, the instinct to know, to understand, to return home. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of Gnosis, not secret knowledge, but intimate knowing. To know as one knows light by feeling its warmth, not by describing its colour. To know as the seed knows the sun before it ever breaks the soil. Oh. It is not learned, it is remembered. In that sense, the rediscovery of the Gnostic texts was never about the past. It was a rehearsal for what humanity will always do. Forget the truth, bury it, and then, when the time is right, dig it up again. Every generation plays both roles, the one that hides the jar and the one that breaks it open. It is the rhythm of consciousness itself, concealment and revelation, darkness and dawn. Even now, perhaps you can for your own feel it. The faint stir of remembrance that is older than language. The sense that you have heard these words before, somewhere between waking and sleep, somewhere before you were born. That feeling is not imagination. It is the memory of the light remembering itself through you. The Gnostics said that salvation is not escape, but integration, that when you finally see clearly, you no longer divide the sacred from the ordinary. The same light that lives in the stars burns quietly in a human hand. The same fullness that created the heavens lives in every moment of awareness, waiting to be recognized. Outside, the day fully arrives. The streets fill with motion. The machines resume their hum. The great wheel of the world spins again. But the awakened one walks through it differently. They no longer seek heaven elsewhere. They see it everywhere. They no longer fear the darkness. They see it as a veil through which the light passes more beautifully. And as the world moves on, indifferent, they carry within them the same unbroken thread that ran through the hearts of those ancient seekers. A remembrance that does not fade, a peace that no empire can command. The story of the Gnostics, after all, was never about escape. It was about presence. It was about living in a world of illusion while knowing it is illusion, loving it anyway, and illuminating it from within. That is where their journey ends. That is where yours continues. The light does not ask to be worshipped. It asks to be seen, and now, through you it is. In every age, after every collapse, humanity begins again by remembering what it once forgot. The ancient words of the Gnostics, rediscovered under Egyptian soil, have become more than historical curiosities. They are living metaphors, reflections of the same hunger that still shapes our time. Because long after their scrolls were buried, their question remained: what does it mean to awaken? That question now moves through modern life in forms the ancients could never have imagined. It hums beneath the surface of science, art and philosophy. It flickers in the works of thinkers who study consciousness, in the voices of those who reject the notion that we are only flesh and chemical reaction. The old myth of the divine spark has found new language. Energy, mind, awareness. When physicists speak of unseen forces binding galaxies together, when neuroscientists describe awareness as the universe observing itself, the echo of the Gnostics hums between the lines. They too believed that the divine is not a being but a state, a presence hidden within creation, yearning to be known. Their myth has become our metaphor, the cosmos awakening to itself through us. And as science peers outward, spirituality continues to turn inward. The meditation halls of the East, the prayer circles of the West, the quiet solitude of those who seek meaning beyond consumption, all share something of the same impulse, the desire to see through the illusion. Modern mystics may not call it Gnosis, but they walk the same path, turning the gaze from sky to soul, from noise to silence, from belief to awareness. Even the arts have become a vessel for this remembrance. Painters fill their canvases with abstract light. Poets speak of hidden wholeness. Filmmakers create worlds where illusion cracks open to reveal deeper truth. Humanity continues to retell the story of Sophia's fall and return, though now it plays out in pixels and in music rather than papyrus and hymns. Her longing, the longing of wisdom to awaken within ignorance, is woven into every act of creativity. But with each new birth of insight comes the same shadow the Gnostics once warned of, the temptation to mistake information for enlightenment. The modern world worships data, speed and certainty. It builds new demiurges, algorithms, ideologies, dreams that glow brighter than the stars. And in that glow the old blindness returns. We scroll endlessly, feeding on symbols of light while forgetting the living light that perceives them. If the ancient Gnostics could see us now, they might not call us fallen. They would call us asleep with the open eyes. We live in a world that has rediscovered all knowledge but lost meaning. We search outward for the divine while ignoring the sacred within every perception. We have traded myth for machinery, but the hunger remains. And yet not all is lost. The same grace that allowed Sophia to rise still flows through creation. Every act of compassion, every flash of genuine wonder, every pause in which awareness adorns turns back upon itself is a small resurrection of the divine. The spark does not die, it waits. And the very fact that we still seek, that we still ask, that we still feel the ache of separation means that the light is working through us even now. In that sense, we are the Gnostics reborn. Though our scriptures are digital and our temples invisible, we too are seekers in an age of noise. We too feel the weight of illusion, the pull toward truth. We too sense that something infinite hides behind the fabric of the ordinary. The same spark that moved through the desert ascetics of Egypt now glows behind the faces on crowded trains, in artists working through the night, in children who stare at the sky and feel something vast watching back. Because Gnosis was never about escape, it was about recognition. To awaken is not to reject the world, but to see it clearly, to feel the divine pulse beating beneath its imperfection. The world is still the body of Sophia, still both fallen and luminous, still reaching upward through its own confusion. And every human act of insight, kindness, or creation helps her rise again. So the echo continues, from papyrus to print, from monasteries to screens, from the whisper of forgotten languages to the silence between thoughts. The light travels unbroken through time, changing form but never meaning. And if you close your eyes now, if you listen closely enough, you might feel it. The same vibration that once moved through the hearts of those long-vanished seekers. It hums in the space between breaths. It waits behind every thought. It is the quiet certainty that you are not separate, that you have never been lost, that awakening is not something to achieve but something to remember. The spark lives, the silence remembers, and through every age the light continues to speak. The wind carries a hush through the ancient valley, an invisible breath moving over stones that once echoed with prayer. The stars above are the same that watched over the scribes of Nag Hammadi, the same that bore witness when Sophia's name was first whispered in candlelight. She was the heart of the Gnostic vision, the mirror of divine wisdom, the mother who fell into shadow so that the world could remember the light through her. Her story was never meant to be myth alone, it was meant to be memory. The memory of what happens when spirit forgets its source, and of what happens when love chooses to descend into the dark to find what was lost. For Sophia, the descent was not punishment, it was mercy. In her yearning to know the unknowable, she created imperfection, and yet it was that imperfection that made compassion possible. From her sorrow came the birth of time, of learning, of awakening. In her fall, the Gnostics saw their own reflection, a spark of the divine trapped in the world, seeking its way back to fullness. In every age, she rises again, not as a goddess of marble and myth, but as a living presence in the human heart. Whenever the world grows too cruel, too certain, too blind to beauty, her voice returns, soft but relentless. She speaks through poets who write of forgiveness, through philosophers who question power, through mothers who cradle the broken and call it sacred. Sophia is not far away. She is the wisdom that bleeds when truth is forgotten. The early Gnostics understood her as both cosmic and personal. They called her Pistis Sophia, faithful wisdom, and believed that her return would come not through conquest, but through remembrance. Each act of kindness, each moment of clarity, each awakening of love within ignorance was another step in her ascent. And they believed that humanity was her companion in that journey, that as we rise, she rises. Today, though few know her name, Sophia moves quietly through our world again. You can see her wherever wisdom confronts despair, where truth speaks against fear, where empathy blooms in the ruins of indifference. You see her in the scientists who search for meaning beyond equations, in the healers who refuse to give up on the broken, in the activists who risk everything for compassion's sake. Every gesture of light in a dark age is a fragment of her resurrection. The Church once buried her beneath its creeds, calling her myth, calling her error. But myths have always carried truths too deep for doctrines to contain. Sophia's tale was never about rebellion against God, it was about reunion with him. Her fall and rise are the same rhythm that beats through every soul, the movement from ignorance to awareness, from separation to unity, from fear to love. Imagine her now, not as a figure of theology, but as a living principle. She is the pulse behind creation's evolution, the intelligence that grows through experience, the part of the divine that learns by forgetting. Every time a human being forgives instead of striking back, She climbs another step toward the pleroma. Every time someone chooses curiosity over fear, she remembers herself a little more. Every time you see the sacred in something ordinary, her light strengthens in the world. Sophia's return is not an event. It is a process unfolding through us. The Gnostics foresaw this, that redemption would not come from the sky, but from the heart. The God would not descend in thunder, but awaken in silence. They believed that the reunion of Sophia and the Source was the completion of the cosmos itself, the moment when every fragment of light gathered from every corner of existence finally remembered its origin. And in that vision, there was no punishment, no apocalypse, no division between heaven and earth, only wholeness, only recognition. Perhaps that is what we are living through now, the long return of Sophia, not in legend, but in consciousness. Her wisdom emerges in psychology's study of integration, in ecology's recognition that all life is one body, in art's insistence that beauty and truth are inseparable. The world that once cast her out now gropes toward her light, though it does not yet know her name. In the end, Sophia is not a figure to be worshipped, but a mirror to be remembered. She is the knowing that lives behind our knowing, the compassion behind our intellect, the forgiveness beneath our justice. She is the divine made human so that the human may remember its divinity. The ancient texts say that when she finally rises, when every spark of her light returns home, creation itself will awaken from its dream. The walls between spirit and matter will dissolve, and the world will see itself as it truly is, a body of light, whole and radiant. But perhaps that has already begun. Perhaps every time you choose understanding over anger, every time you recognize your own reflection in a stranger, a small piece of Sophia ascends. Perhaps her redemption is not distant. It is now, in the quiet revolutions of love that pass unnoticed. And when she finally returns in full through all of us, remembering together, the world will not end, boy. It will simply open its eyes. The world is quiet again. Evening stretches across the horizon, the same way it must have on the night when the last Gnostic scribe set down his pen, sealed the jar, and buried it beneath the Egyptian sand. The desert wind whispers through the same cliffs, shaping them grain by grain, as if time itself were a patient sculptor. The stars return, unchanging, indifferent, eternal. If the Gnostics could see us now, our satellites circling the globe, our glowing screens mimicking the stars, our endless search for meaning in the machinery they could never have imagined, they might not be surprised. They would only ask, as they always did, "What have you remembered?" Because for all our knowledge, for all our noise, that is still the only question that matters. Not what we believe, but what we remember. What truth, buried beneath fear and ambition and distraction, still burns quietly inside us, waiting to be recognized. The Gnostics taught that every soul carries a fragment of the divine, a spark that once fell from the fullness, wandered through shadow, and longs to return. And though centuries have passed, the longing has not faded. It hides in every act of creation, in every heartbreak, in every attempt to understand what love really means. It hides in our eyes when we look at the night sky and feel both infinitely small and impossibly vast. Their myth was never just about gods and worlds, it was about this endless, miraculous paradox of being both lost and found, both human and divine. The fall of Sophia was the world learning to feel. The exile of the soul was the birth of compassion. The return to the light is the recognition that nothing was ever truly separated at all. When the farmer cracked open the jar at Nag Hammadi, he didn't just rediscover old texts. He reawakened a truth that humanity had been dreaming toward for centuries, that divinity is not somewhere else but everywhere, that the voice of God is not confined to scripture or temple or creed, but hums beneath every moment of awareness, that heaven is not a place but a perception. And so the story closes, not with destruction, but with realization, not with apocalypse, but with awakening. The same world that once buried the light has become the world through which it shines. The same humanity that once silenced Sophia has become the instrument of her return. Every mind that remembers, every heart that opens, every soul that forgives, brings us closer to the fullness they once described. It is tempting to think of the Gnostics as a people of the past, voices trapped in parchment defeated by time. But their truth was never meant to end. It lives now, as it always did, in the space between ignorance and awareness. It lives in the moments when we stop seeking outside ourselves and turn inwards toward the light that has always been there. That light does not demand. It does not shout. It only waits, patient, ancient, merciful. It waits for you to notice it. It waits for you to remember that you are never separate from it. The final mystery the Gnostics left us is not written in any codex, not hidden in any cave. It is the silence after every word, the pause before every breath, the stillness in which all creation hums, when you sit quietly, when you breathe deeply, when you let the noise of the world fall away, you will feel it, the spark, the fullness, the home you never truly left. The Gnostics once wrote, "Those who have come to know themselves have already reached the knowledge of the all." They meant that the journey outward, through belief, through history, through life itself, is really a circle leading back inward, to the place where the divine and the human meet. And so this story, which began in the deserts of Egypt and passed through centuries of silence, ends exactly where you are now, in awareness. You are the last line of the manuscript. You are the living continuation of what they sought. Close your eyes, breathe, listen. You will hear it. The same voice that spoke to the seekers 2,000 years ago. It says nothing new because truth never changes. You are from the light. You are of the light. You are the light remembering itself. And as long as someone somewhere remembers, the story will never end.